One summer when I was in college, I found a job posting for a local high-end boutique catering business. And I needed some extra money that summer. I was going into my senior year and I was planning on buying Caitlin an engagement ring. And so I needed all the extra money that I could possibly get. I didn't have any formal kitchen experience, but I felt pretty confident in my cooking skills, especially from being able to sort of watch my grandmother and mother work in the kitchen and sort of pick up little things from them. And so I applied to this job. I figured, what's the worst that could happen? Either I was the only one who applied or they were really desperate, because the owner of the catering business called me the next day and told me to show up on Friday for work. When I arrived, she threw me an apron, told me to wash my hands, and then asked me to go ahead and start dicing onions. And there seemed like hundreds of onions that were laid out. So I followed her instructions, and after a minute or two of dicing, she came over to inspect my work. She told me that I was using the wrong type of knife for dicing onions. I'm sorry, I quickly said. Which knife do you want me to use? She handed me the chef's knife, and I handed her back the small utility knife that I had been using. I guess my grandma used the wrong knives too. Of course, I wouldn't tell her that. So I started dicing the onions while the owner was still peering over my shoulder. After a few chops, she quickly jumped in and said, No, let me show you. You don't actually chop the onions, she said. You need the blade of the knife to stay in contact with the cutting board, and you go up and down and back and forth in a sort of rocking motion. That's how you cut them, she said, and make sure they're the same size. I didn't lie on my resume, but I could see at that moment she was wondering what on earth I was doing in the kitchen. After an hour or so of cutting onions, she gave me the green light to move on to other vegetable prep. She told me to cut the bell peppers into strips with 45-degree angles on one end. These were going to be on vegetable trays, and so the appearance of them were just as important as the vegetable. I can do that, I told her, and so I went back to the knife stand and stood there for a while. She apparently could tell I didn't know which knife to use, so she came back over and handed me a slightly smaller knife. When I finished cutting the bell peppers, she came and inspected them, and after a little pause, she said, I guess I can make that work, which told me that my 45-degree angles were just a little off. Math was never my strong suit. I continued learning about cutting vegetables and helping in the kitchen the best I could. And I learned quite a bit in just a few weeks' time, but I could definitely tell that I was struggling to meet her professional chef expectations. After a couple weeks, I showed up for work, and one day she stopped me outside of the kitchen. Have you ever done insulation before? Before I could respond with no, she said, it's not hard, you'll get the hang of it. So for the next part of the summer, instead of working in the kitchen cutting vegetables, I installed insulation for her in her new barn. Then, of course, she needed someone to install insulation. I think it was more or less her way of firing me in a nice type of way from the kitchen. Now, I doubt anyone here can say that they failed at chopping vegetables like me. And in fact, this is a story I love to tell people. I'll tell people I worked at a high-end boutique catering business. I just so happen to usually leave out the last part. But each of us have different failures in life, things that we've tried to do and ended up being unsuccessful. Now, none of us like to admit that we have failed. Failure within our culture is something that we are largely fearful of. We don't want others to see our failures and think that we're not the successful people that we try to portray ourselves as. And when we do fail, oftentimes we feel a sense of shame. We feel bad or wrong or even unworthy. And because of that, sometimes we avoid trying to do something in the first place because we don't want to end up with the disappointment if we do fail. And I think that even happens in our faith and especially in our life together as the church. We are afraid of failure. But what I want us to see today is that fearing failure is actually an unfaithful attitude. Fearing failure is an unfaithful attitude. And to do that, we're of course going to look at this story of Peter failing to walk on water. So to do this, let's go ahead and dive into this amazing story. As you heard, Jesus sends the disciples out across the sea on a boat. Jesus is going to spend some time by himself on a mountain praying, and he tells them that he'll meet up with them later. Now, without Jesus by their side, this is where the disciples get in a little bit of a trouble. A storm brews up, the wind is howling, the waves are crashing. And even though these disciples are trained fishermen who should be sort of experts at the sea, their fear begins to set in as they struggle in the storm all night long. By morning, we're told the storm had still not let up. And so Jesus finally decides to join the disciples on the boat. So he leaves his mountain and just casually walks across the water toward them like it's no big deal. Now, as if the disciples weren't afraid enough, they see this figure walking towards them and they cry out that it's a ghost. Trying to calm their fears, Jesus assures them, "It's me, Jesus, do not be afraid." And then this is where Peter gets a little bold. He tells Jesus, "Lord, command me to come out onto the water with you." So Jesus does. Peter climbs out of the boat and begins walking on the water. At first he was doing great, and then a big gust of wind blows up and the waves get stronger. Fear comes over Peter and he begins to doubt that he can actually get to Jesus. And it's at this moment that he actually begins to sink into the sea. But Jesus immediately reaches out and grabs Peter, pulling him to safety. When I read the story this week, I couldn't help but think about how Peter failed to walk across the water. And I think we can all agree that he did, in fact, fail. He failed to accomplish what he had set out to do. And Peter has actually been criticized about this throughout all of history. We say things like, if only Peter had kept his eyes on Jesus, then he would have been able to keep walking on the sea. If only Peter had stronger faith. If only he hadn't doubted. If only he hadn't failed. Are some of the things we say. And yet, I don't think we should be that hard on Peter. I don't think we should criticize his lack of faith or his failure to walk across the water. Instead, what I want us to see is he demonstrates an immense amount of faith. Notice, he is, after all, the only disciple who was willing to even get out of the boat, to leave behind his comfort and his security as he tries to walk closer to Jesus. Peter's faith did not fail him. He doesn't allow his fears to get in the way. His faith is what gave him the strength to get out of the boat and take that first step. And though he does technically fail to reach Jesus, it's through his failures that Jesus reaches him. I think this story has a lot to teach us about failure. The story encourages us that failure is not something to be ashamed about. It's not something we should try to avoid. Peter fails and he becomes one of the most influential church leaders. He is, after all, Jesus' right-hand man. And Peter fails here walking on water. He fails in fishing. It seems like every story in the Bible that involves Peter involves him failing in some way. He fails when he denies Jesus leading up to the resurrection. Peter fails over and over again, and yet even with these failures, Jesus continues to lean on Peter and calls him to be the rock that the church desperately needed. Peter failed not just once or twice, and that didn't stop Jesus from working through him. It didn't stop Jesus from trusting that Peter had exactly what the world needed. And I think that should remind us that our own failures are not indictments on our faith. Failing at faith is only when we allow our failures to prevent us from taking that next step forward. You see, time and time again, Peter fails, but his faith propels him to take that next step, to move forward, to learn, to grow, to challenge himself and others. By taking those steps, he's able to walk closer to Jesus. By not being afraid to fail, Peter learns what he needs to lead the church into the future. I think learning to fail is an important thing for us to be able to do as individuals, but I think it's also an important for us to be able to do as the church. As a church, we should not be afraid of failing. Rather, I think we need to learn that failure is a faithful part of our lives together. I was reading an article from another minister on this very topic, and they said this: the world desperately needs Christians and churches to innovate, to try new methods of spreading the gospel, and to test new ways of connecting our communities together. But too many ministers and churches are paralyzed by an unhealthy fear of failure, especially when expanding into new areas. Failure isn't connected to spiritual weakness. Failure is a part of our road as disciples. Failure is part of our road as disciples. I don't think this statement could be truer. Churches are all too often afraid to fail. And when we're afraid to fail, we don't take the steps, the faithful steps that Jesus is calling us to make. We use the same knives that we've always been using. We don't try new programs and ministries. We don't let go of things that we should. We don't reimagine what it means to be the church. When we're afraid to fail, we don't do things like form bold partnerships with other groups in our community. We don't make room for creativity and ingenuity. When we're afraid to fail, we don't allow the church to be the church that Jesus calls us to be. And here's the thing, friends. The needs of our world and of our communities are too great and too deep for us to be afraid to fail. Our world doesn't need us to stay in our boats. Our world doesn't need us to play it safe because we think we might sink. No, our world needs the church to be bold, to be risky, to think bigger and bigger, to try new things, to love recklessly. Our world needs us to be like Peter, to have the faith to step out into the dangerous waters and be willing to sink for the sake of Jesus. We need to be willing to sink for the sake of Jesus. So I want to challenge us as a church to get comfortable with failure, to expect failure, and in fact, not to be shamed about it. Because even when we fail, the good news is that Jesus is right there, stretching out his hand to save us. And friends, that doesn't sound like failure to me. Amen.